After months of speculation, Pierre-Luc Dubois is no longer a Winnipeg Jet and has now been traded to the Los Angeles Kings. The Jets got a surprisingly large package in return for Dubois, and you know what? I may not agree with the direction the Jets are going in, but if you're going to be competitive and try to stay relevant, this is a heck of a way to start off your offseason. We'll dive into all of that and more on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is completely free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. But most of all, we just really love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Now, like I said, biggest topic of the day in Winnipeg right now and really around the league is that Pierre-Luc Dubois is no longer a Winnipeg Jet. And I'm sure a lot of us probably breathed a bit of a sigh of relief. This saga has been going on for months. We know that Dubois really wanted to just kind of go elsewhere, not stay around with the Jets, not re-sign. I think we knew from kind of, the past season or so that Dubois was bound for elsewhere. And it's not really shocking. I mean, you saw how things went down in Columbus. We all kind of knew that at some point he'd probably want to move on from Winnipeg. So the Jets were kind of hemming and hawing and trying to figure out the best way to do this. And, one of the biggest, I think, narratives that kind of sprang out of all of this was that Dubois was going to be a Montreal Canadian. They were the team that was most hot and heavy for Dubois. There were questions about whether Montreal might even just wait for him to become a free agent. Why sit there and trade for a player if you could just sign him for free later? And I think a lot of Montreal fans kind of misunderstood why that was a very silly notion. A player who's as talented as Dubois is and who may have a bit of a spotty record in terms of reputation, the reality is, a lot of teams around the league are going to look at his skill sets and talents and recognize him as being a really, really phenomenally interesting player and somebody that if you give him the change of scenery that he really wants, get him to a place where he actually wants to live and isn't just traded to or drafted to, maybe you'll start to see him really blossom into a wonderful player. And so, with the Jets kind of, on the outs with Dubois, in steps the LA Kings. And we've talked about the Kings before. I mentioned on yesterday's episode that I thought the trade with them was imminent. Based on who was talking about the deal, it seemed like it was more or less really close at hand. And so Winnipeg, obviously, it took a little bit to get it over the line. There were some cap considerations, some complications, and not everything was peachy, squeaky clean, I guess, right? We sort of knew that this was going to be a long negotiation. Dubois wanted a long-term deal. And, with the Kings trying to figure out the cap situation, it kind of naturally fell to LA to basically kind of finalize the deal. The trade package that the Jets received was decided on, I think, in relatively short order over the past couple of days. The biggest question, though, was would Dubois sign a long-term deal and essentially do an 8-year sign-and trade? Because that's the only way the Kings were going to pay up for his services. And thankfully, they actually managed to agree to terms. His new contract is for $8.5 million per season for 8 years. And if you ask me, it's interesting, right? It's very expensive in terms of what we saw out of Dubois in his tenure here with the Jets. And I think for what he brings on the ice, I'm a little mixed on it, right? There are two versions of Dubois that I think are realistically possible. The first is that unstoppable force of nature with a great shot and a nose for the slot. We saw that sometimes with Dubois at in about half of the season, but the other half of the year he was kind of a ghost, and I feel like it's hard to know which version of him you're getting. Now, in Dubois' defense, he got traded to a team that, quite frankly, he didn't really have much of a connection to except for his dad. And other than that, he didn't really ask to come to Winnipeg. He basically got out of Dodge in Columbus and, ended up in Winnipeg for a couple of seasons. Thought maybe things would kind of work out and he'd be willing to stay and stick around. But I think we all knew at some point he'd probably want to go elsewhere. And Montreal, of course, seemed like the most natural destination, but the Habs didn't want to pay up. And so LA, as a close second for places you could live, I feel like is a pretty good destination. And that sort of came about pretty late over the past, I would say, day or two. Pat Brisson, who is Dubois' agent, basically indicated to the teams that LA was Dubois' new intended destination. And I found that very interesting. I don't know if it's because Dubois just felt like LA is a nice place to live and they were offering him the sort of contract money that he was looking for, or if there was something else going on. But either way, the Jets made the deal, the trade went through, and everything kind of kicked off. And the Jets, you know what? They did really well. You might be wondering who all is in the trade package. So the total package, which actually kind of caught me off guard, is Gabriel Vilardi, Alex Iafallo, Rasmus Kupari, and then a second-round pick, which I believe is Montreal's pick, and that should be around the 33rd overall this year, which is pretty darn spiffy, right? Now, obviously, there are some interesting things to consider with this trade and who all the Jets got in return. We'll talk about each of these components and why the Jets kind of did pretty well here to get this across the finish line in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, I do want to shout out our friends and partners at Game Time. When it comes to buying tickets and stuff, whether it's for events or concerts, whatever you're interested in, you always know that buying tickets usually is a bit of a hassle. It's expensive, it takes time, and when you buy in advance, oftentimes you're paying tons of fees. And honestly, you have to ask yourself if it's really worth it. Game Time is here to help. They offer a great selection of last-minute tickets and flash deals on tons of your favorite events and sporting arenas. And best of all, they help give you in-venue views from where you're planning to sit, so you'll get a great idea of whether or not your view is obstructed, what you'll be seeing for the course of the event, and you get a great preview of what it's like to actually be there. And best of all, when it comes to last-minute tickets, you know that usually means much lower prices, so Game Time is helping you save time and money. Instead of planning months in advance and paying all of this money for tickets, Game Time is here to help to give you the biggest hookup for all of the hottest events, and you get some of the lowest prices. And if you find a seat in the same row and section that is less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So if you're ready to get started, snag the tickets without the stress by getting Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, to get started, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hello, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Welcome back as we are talking about, quite a few fun things. Obviously, the biggest news of the day is that the Winnipeg Jets have traded Pierre-Luc Dubois to the LA Kings. Now, before we dive into what the Jets got in return, I do want to shout out a really cool thing that the Locked On NHL Network is doing ahead of the draft on Wednesday. After today's show, be sure to check out Locked On's 2023 Mock Draft Special. The local hosts of the Locked On NHL channel have made their picks, and hosts Gil Martin and Hadi Kalikechi break down every selection over a 3-day mock draft event. Find the episodes on Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. I've even got our pick, Edouard Chalet, and you can hear about why I chose Chalet on the special, 10 or so minute episode, along with the rest of our second half picks. But obviously the draft is coming up, and with all the trades and stuff, that naturally meant that there was some excitement building up for this particular trade with the Pierre-Luc Dubois deal, because maybe the Jets would get some futures or something. But we knew that Winnipeg was really interested more in roster players. And what the Jets got back, I would say, is actually more than I was expecting, especially for the fact that the Jets only gave up Pierre-Luc Dubois. Now, let's be clear. Dubois is technically the best player in this trade. But I think it would be very much a mistake to overlook what else Winnipeg got. So the primary piece coming back in this is, of course, Gabriel Vilardi. And Vilardi, for me, is a really cool player. I'm a big fan of his. I've loved his game for many years. He's super smart in the slot. He's got a great shot. He's a very solid skater, not afraid to get into the forecheck, and just a really interesting volume shooter who gets into the right areas. He kind of does the things that I wish Kyle Connor did, because Kyle is a really creative player, great skater, great shooter, but there's kind of a disconnect when it comes to how he uses space and where he positions himself. With Vilardi, you don't really have to worry about that as much. Gabe is ready to go. He's a great player. And the only thing that you really have to worry about with him is that injury history that kind of did hold him back from kickstarting his pro career. That is a legitimate concern. I'm not going to pretend that it isn't. And he's also an RFA. So I guess for the Jets, the big question is, what do you want to sign him for? Do you want to do a short-term 3-year bridge, or do you want to gamble a little bit and try for 5 years? He doesn't have the most established track record at the NHL level, but I feel pretty confident in saying that regardless of whether Vilardi wins a center spot here for the Jets or plays out wide, he's going to be a menace. I think he's an immediate help for the top six. I think in terms of, a one-to-one swap for Dubois, he might not actually be a downgrade. In fact, he might actually be better than Dubois in a couple of key facets, especially when it comes to like that finishing and shot creation. Maybe he ends up being a better overall player. So, the Jets might have gotten a real gem in Vilardi. Like I said, I'm a big fan of his, and he's only 23. Now, Iafallo, for me, I mentioned as kind of being like a middle six guy. I still stick to that. I think he's very decent. I think he's a pesky player, and I think he likes to get down low in the slot and create some havoc around the net and chaos. But interestingly, I've seen some rumors suggesting that he might get flipped. Now, for me, I'm kind of ambivalent in terms of that. I like Iafallo a lot, and I think he's a very nice rotational option for the Jets, especially on like the third line. But if the Jets were to try and trade him and take advantage of a weaker free agent and trade market this year, I wouldn't hate that. I don't know what the Jets exactly would get for Iafallo, but he could be a really decent trade piece with the right team. But that said, I am planning to have him with the Jets this coming season. I feel like that is just the most natural outcome. I think Winnipeg is probably not in a great position to start trading away forwards unless they are, really interested in acquiring some higher round picks this year. If they can get themselves like a solid second or even low end first round pick for Iafallo, not that I think it's likely, but in the off chance that they could squeeze one out somehow, I would not hate that. But in terms of just having him on the team, yeah, like I said, really solid third liner. Now, you might be wondering about Kupari, right? Rasmus is a player I haven't really talked about before because it wasn't clear who the extra roster young player from the Kings was going to be. Kupari is one of those guys that I think has shown flashes of very intriguing skill as like a third line player who can roll down the middle and sort of be a big, strong, smooth skater with a solid shot and relatively smart offensive instincts. Kupari could be very intriguing. Now, I don't think he's going to have a lot of upside. And, the original thought was that Harkins was going the other way. That didn't happen. Jansen is still a Jet. And so Kupari could kind of be considered like another Harkins of a sort. I think Rasmus has some interesting signs that maybe there's more of a player to him than meets the eye, but he never really had much ice time with the Kings. Didn't really seize, I would say, like a big role, but he also wasn't given, as far as I know, a ton of opportunities to really take a hold of the chance. So maybe he's kind of a punt and he turns into something really solid for the Jets. I would say if the best case scenario turns out, he's probably like a 35 to 40 point player, which for a toss-in for this deal would be phenomenal. So Kupari, very fun player, could be a nice bottom 6 addition. Second round pick, I mean, what do you even have to say about it? It's Montreal's pick. It's kind of funny to rub it in Montreal's face. And I'm sure Habs fans are absolutely losing their mind. I feel like that pick was honestly just included to troll the Habs. I'm sure, like, in terms of kind of sending a message about the whole Dubois trade, Winnipeg very much made it clear that LA was Dubois' destination, and I think they've done a pretty phenomenal job. If I'm going to give this trade a rating in isolation without the context that I'd prefer the team to rebuild, the trade by itself gets an A from me. I think they've done well, and I think given the circumstances, you could not ask for much better. Now, the Jets might be interested in at least one other player, and we'll talk about why Travis Sanheim is suddenly in Winnipeg's crosshairs in just a little bit. Hello, friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We're just wrapping up really quickly with some final thoughts ahead of continued trade stuff around both the Winnipeg Jets and the rest of the NHL. Now, the Jets aren't, clearly done with the trade market, right? We know that the Dubois trade was kind of the first big chimichanga to fall, but now we're turning our eyes towards Scheifele and Hellebuyck. But one name that did pop up from another team is Travis Sanheim. The Philadelphia Flyers are absolutely cleaning house. They're dumping lots of contracts. They're going for futures. And one of the players that seems to be on the outs is Travis Sanheim. Sanheim is, an immediate upgrade for the Jets defense. If Winnipeg can find a way to clear some cap space, whether it's buying Wheeler out or doing something else, I think Sanheim would very clearly fit Winnipeg's plans. And I know people say, well, he's a lefty, but he's actually played on the right side a fair bit, and he's been pretty good there. I think in terms of what the Jets would like on their back end, which is more offensive mobility and some really strong two-way acumen, Sanheim's a really safe bet. I know that he had a down year over the past season or so, but if you get him to a new team, you get him away from some of the anchors that he's been playing with the Flyers, and you put him in Winnipeg, I think that there's a really good chance that Sanheim starts to blossom again and reminds people of why he was considered one of Philadelphia's best defenders. I think his potential for the Jets would be immense. I think he could be a really strong player, and he signed to what could be a team-friendly deal if he recovers form. Now, obviously, it is a bit of a gamble. He signed for a couple more seasons, and he's not cheap, but I think in terms of what the Jets need and what their blue line really could benefit from, Sanheim is a risk I'd be willing to take. I think if the Jets are looking to kind of swing on players, especially guys who you could say are even homegrown players because he's from Manitoba, I feel like you really couldn't go wrong with a guy who was, raised and sort of did like the youth hockey system in the region. Sanheim, obviously he has some cosmetic issues with this game. He's not perfect, but he would basically be second only to Morrissey on this team if he were to join. So for me, if you're trying to play local and trade local, I feel like Sanheim is a clear target, and the Jets were interested in acquiring him. Now, interestingly, he has a no-trade clause that kicks in, I think, towards the end of this week, and so for Philadelphia, there's kind of an imperative to move him. And the Jets were not really interested in moving the 18th overall pick for him. So I feel like if Winnipeg is patient and nobody else swoops in here for Sanheim, this might actually end up being a really good trade for the Jets. As far as, Winnipeg's own expiring free agents are concerned, Scheifele to Boston still feels like what I'm moving towards. I think I saw somebody mention that they were clearing cap in Boston for Bertuzzi, but I can tell you if Krejci and Bergeron are about to hang it up, Scheifele's a Bruin. I don't know that there's any other team that desperately needs a center in the way that the Bruins would really need Scheifele. But I guess the biggest question is, are the Bruins in even a good spot to trade for him? As far as Hellebuyck is concerned, I still think New Jersey makes the most sense. New Jersey just traded away Mackenzie Blackwood, conveniently opening up a spot in net for a new starter. So, Hellebuyck, you're probably a devil. Wish you well. Hope you do really well for New Jersey. I feel like that makes a lot of sense. And maybe the Jets can acquire a center in one of these deals. Winnipeg is definitely lacking depth down the middle. And while Vilardi, Perfetti, and all of these young guys can probably do the job reasonably well, I think the Jets could benefit from adding at least one more young center into the organizational fold. But Let me know how you feel about all of the trade rumors. How do you feel the Jets did in this major Dubois trade? Drop your thoughts and comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. But for tonight's episode, that is going to be all the time that we have. Stay tuned to all of the content for the rest of the week as we dive into Winnipeg's draft picks tomorrow and any trade updates as Scheifele and Hellebuck move on to greener pastures. But for tonight's episode, like I said, that is all the time that we have. Thanks so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day. We will see you back here tomorrow. Stay safe, have a great one, and go Jets go.